if relationships doesn't happen on our timeline, we're falling behind. And sometimes this forces a panic for us to make choices that necessarily doesn't align up with what God has in store for us. We would either choose compromise and settling, or we would choose holy contentment. And so I want to look at a couple of definitions because I came from different scriptures, and the first word is going to be compromise. So the world's definition of compromise is making concessions to reach an agreement. The spiritual reality is lowering God's holy standard to accommodate human fear. It is trading a permanent covenant for temporary comfort. So for an example, you know God has called you to build a business, right? With absolute integrity and kingdom impact. But because funding is tight and the process is slow, you decide to partner with an investor who does not share your faith, values, or ethics just to get a quick influx of cash. So you lower the standard of the spiritual alignment that was already fixed. And you did that out of panic. So you began to compromise. The next word is going to be settling. And the world's definition is accepting a lower standard because it is a safe and easy thing to do. The spiritual reality is when you settle, it's out of anxiousness. It's a fear-based transaction. You look at the clock, you panic, and accept a situation that doesn't align with God's will because you are terrified that He will not complete His promises. Then we have contentment. The world's definition of contentment is actually giving up in flat resignation, like you don't have nothing. It's just like you're just not going to do anything. When I look up the Hebrew definition of contentment, the word is derived from yashab. It means to dwell, to remain, and to be securely seated, meaning your soul is firmly anchored. The Greek definition and the word is tarkes. It's in the Strong's. It means sufficient in oneself, adequate, needing no existence, content within yourself through Christ, entirely independent of external circumstances. And then we have covenant. The world's definition of covenant is just a two-way contract. Okay, the Hebrew definition is bereaved, a permanent, unconditional blood bond. God binds His very character to His promise. And the Greek definition is pronounced dea tekai. It's a disposition or arrangement which one wishes to be valid. A last disposition which one makes of his early possessions after death, and a last will and testament. So God alone sets the terms. You simply just trust and inherit it. And then the last one is will. A determination, choice, purpose, decree, or inclination of what God has determined shall be done. So I want us to be able to understand the severe danger of settling and compromising. And I want us to go to Genesis chapter 15 and look how God had a covenant with Abram. I'm going to read from the NIV version. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid. Abram, I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless at the one who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus? And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him his righteousness, to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with the dove and the young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other, the birds. However, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set, darkness had fallen, a smoke fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land. So I want us to understand something. When he gave him this word, this was literally 10 years before Sarah decided that they would give Hagar to Abram. And usually when we're waiting, the enemy begins to attack our faith. So whether we're waiting to hear about a good report from the doctors, whether we're waiting to, start a business, whether we're waiting on a relationship, marriage, just anything, or purchasing a house, the enemy begins to attack our faith, especially when God had already told us that he was going to do something for us, and it didn't happen in that moment. And so I want us to read Genesis chapter 16, verse 1 through 4. And it says, now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai and his wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to the husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarah said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between me and you. Your servant is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think is best. Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So I want to give you some cultural background on Abram and Sarah. So they were from, they had migrated to Canaan. Their standard from where they're from, which is Mesopotamia, they are legally bound in that culture to give their husbands to their maids if they hadn't had children. So she thought that it was best for her to go ahead and legally just, okay, I don't have any children yet, let me just go ahead and give you my maidservant because we can do that. By law, we can do that. And that's the Mesopotamian law. If a woman remained barren after a certain number of years, she was legally obligated to provide her husband with a slave. And under these laws, the child born to the slave was legally considered the child of the heir and the wife of the husband, not the slave. So when Sarah said, perhaps I can build a family through her, she was invoking her legal rights in that moment. She used a worldly cultural shortcut to bypass the supernatural delay. Mm-hmm. And because of his human mind, and because of Abram's reaction, and he agreed, because that's what it says, is that he agreed, and you're wondering why didn't he fight it? He probably thought because it was legally okay for them to do that, that God was going to provide that child through their maidservant. Well, we do that today. We do that when we think that things
that was real life.
are not going how we wanted to do. It was a standard practice. He reasoned, well, this is how society fixes this problem, so maybe this is how God intends to do it. We do this exact same thing. We get tired of waiting on God's supernatural move, so we look at the culture's rule book, we look at what is legally permitted, socially acceptable, and convenient, and we use human contracts to try and manufacture our own divine destiny. So, when we're talking about compromise, and we're compromising our personal relationship, and everybody's like, oh, he was a father of faith, but in this moment, they literally, and I'm going to go down the timeline, because we're going to go down the timeline and how long it was before they even actually gave birth to their promised child. But I want to look at something, because when Ishmael was born, he was born, and Ishmael is Hagar's son. So when he was born, it wasn't a mistake biologically. He was a monument to human panic and a secular legality. So when he was born out of compromise. So the compromise was lowering the standard of what God had already told Abram. He was born out of fear. So Sarah was looking at her aging body and believing God had run out of options. And then he was born out of convenience, picking an easy, culturally accepted shortcut that was right inside the tent. So it was convenient for them to be able to just go ahead and say, okay, well, we already got a maidservant, already by law, we can go ahead and conceive a child through her, and then bondage. But he was birthed out of bondage because his mother was a slave woman. So his existence was bound to the legalistic track of trying to force by human sweat and earthly law what only God can do by grace. So there's a clash of culture versus contentment, or covenant, So I want to look how quickly the flesh shortcut backfired. The moment Hagar conceived, the Bible said that she began to despise Sarah. Right? So in Genesis 16:4, it said that she started despising her once she found out she was pregnant. Why? Because the ancient law codes also state, so when I did research to see what happens when the mother, if they conceive a child or if it's a boy, well, what happens is the law stated that if a surrogate slave bore a male child, her status then rise up in the household of the king or the husband and the wife. So that means you can't sell her as a slave. And that means her status changes in the household. So now she got more confidence. Okay? She got more confidence. She done gained a little bit of leverage over the childless wife. So now you walking around with a child and you the wife, the main chick. We finna go. You the main chick, but you don't have a child, and so now you're upset because you done created this chaos and you thought you was working and helping God. God don't need your help. Right. Close that. Come on. So Sarah tried to use this law of the world to help God out, and the exact law turned around and mocked her inside her own home. So when you manufacture an Ishmael situation in your life out of haste and cultural alignment, you become entirely responsible for sustaining in your own strength.
My God, that's good.
So then I want to talk about the Isaac birth. On the other side of this stands Isaac, and Isaac was born exclusively out of the promise. He was born exclusively out of supernatural grace. He wasn't born out of human control. It wasn't something that had to be manipulated. It wasn't something that was convenient, a shortcut. He literally was born out of faith, endurance, and a holy patience. And so when we wait for our Isaac, the outcome doesn't produce domestic warfare or emotional turmoil or drain. It carries the uncompromised blessing and generational weight of the Almighty. So I want to go down the timeline. I said I was going to go down the timeline of Abram. So year one, he was age 75. So that's when he first, back in chapter 15, when he first got his initial promise, he was age 75. Then year 10, he didn't hear nothing else. After that, he was 85 years old. So they began to panic. So after they began to panic, and that's over a whole decade of waiting, of not hearing nothing, they compromised. Then you got next year, guess what's birthed out of that compromise? Not the promised son, it was the other son, Ishmael. And then year 24, he's 99, then the angels visited him again. So that's 13 years of total silence from heaven.
Wow.
The Lord and two angels finally visit the tent. And then year 25, when he's finally 100 years old, the promise, the true promise, Isaac is finally born. And the angels visited Sarah. Sarah laughed, of course, and she was like, this is not going, this can't happen. And God bypassed her defense and it's crazy because it's like you can't be mad at nobody else but yourself because you created this issue.
Yeah.
But even with us creating our own issues, and when God says he's going to do something, the promise is still going to happen. It just might be delayed because we're doing our own stuff. Mm-hmm. And he had asked her, is there anything too hard for the Lord? I want to talk about how when we refuse to learn how to be content, because they weren't content in that moment. They weren't patient in that moment. When we're not content, we don't just create delays like Sarah. We risk throwing away our entire destiny for temporary feeling. So I want to look at their grandchildren. And it makes sense because it's a pattern in this bloodline if you actually really look at the stories. Esau lacked contentment.
My Lord.
So we're going to look at how the lack of contentment meets a moment of intense physical appetite. So Esau was the firstborn son of Isaac, which meant he possessed the birthright. So this is the birthright, the promise that came from his grandfather, Abraham. Everything that he was going to have, it was his right to have, right? So in ancient times, the birthright was everything. It was a double portion of the family inheritance, but more, it was everything. It was a double portion of the family inheritance, but more importantly, it carried the spiritual headship of the family. The responsibility to carry forward the covenant promise God made to Abram. It was holy, generational treasure, but Esau lacked internal contentment. He lived entirely controlled by his immediate senses. So I want us to read Genesis 25, 29 through 34. And then it says, once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, quick, let me have some of the red stew. I'm famished. That is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, first, sell me your birthright. Look, I am about to die. Esau said, what good is the birthright to me? But Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore an oath to him, selling him his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. And Esau despised his birthright. So the deception here of discontentment, Esau came in from hunting and was hungry. His hunger was real, but it wasn't devastating to the point where he was like really gonna die. It was just a major exaggeration, in that moment. Just like, I'm so hungry, my stomach, about to hit the floor type of thing. And so his exaggeration was fueled by a lack of endurance. Because he could not master his temporary discomfort, he looked at something holy and spiritual, which was his birthright, and decided it was worthless compared to a hot bowl of soup. Mm-hmm. He traded a lifetime of generational authority for 20 minutes of physical satisfaction, and we all been there. Ooh, that's nice. When you are not content, your temporary hunger will make an expensive mistake look cheap. This contentment will convince you that your spiritual standards are useless if they aren't giving you what you want in that moment. It will drive you to sell your peace, your integrity, the calling you have on your life just to satisfy temporary emotional and physical appetite, you will eat the enemy's food today and wake up empty tomorrow. So I want to talk about the connection between their grandparents and them, because you'll see a connection between these two generations, because the enemy uses the exact same playbook on their children that he used on their grandparents. So Abraham and Sarah, they on the outside looking in. They didn't have the child yet. They had a promise written in the stars, but their arms were completely empty, right? Out of sheer panic and haste and severe lack of patience, they tried to force the promise by manufacturing an Ishmael out of convenience and out of fear. Esau on the other side, he was on the inside looking out. He didn't have to wait for the promise. He was already born into it. Isaac was the true chosen son of the covenant, born purely out of promise, not bondage. And now out of Isaac came the two brothers, Esau, the firstborn. He literally woke up every morning holding a spiritual deed to the covenant promise God made to him. And he didn't have to work for it. And he didn't have to wait for it. He possessed it by that right. But because of his discontentment, Abraham and Sarah suffered because they wanted the promise so badly. They tried to rush it in the flesh. Esau suffered because he had the promise and he treated it like it was completely worthless. While his grandparents panicked over an empty womb, Esau panicked over an empty stomach. He allowed a temporary physical feeling, 20 minutes of hunger, to make him look at his holy birthright and say, what good is this to me? And because he couldn't handle his temporary moment of discomfort, he handed this birthright over to his brother Jacob, and a single decision based entirely on temporary emotion cost him a lifetime of turmoil. The Bible tells us later on that when he wanted to inherit his blessing, right? When he wanted to inherit his blessing, he was rejected, and he wept bitter tears. But that couldn't change. That didn't change the fact that he had traded his eternal legacy for a quick fix. So whether you're waiting for a promise like Sarah or standing in the middle of a blessing like Esau, if you do not master your emotions, your temporary feelings will bankrupt your future.
It's good stuff.
And so Paul talks about this later on in Galatians chapter 4, verse 22 through 31. And it says, for it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bound maid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bound woman was born after the flesh. So this is just backing up everything that I said. But he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of the promise. But as then he was born after the flesh, persecuted him that was born after the spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the scripture? Cast out the bound woman and her son, for the son of the bound woman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bound woman, but we are free. Paul uses Abraham's story as an allegory. Hagar represents Mount Sinai, the law, human effort, and legalistic bondage. Sarah represents the heavenly Jerusalem, freedom of the covenant promise. And so when you get tired of waiting and you settle, you are choosing Hagar. You are choosing a life of slavery, human effort. And notice in verse 29, it says, the flesh will always persecute the spirit. So when you settle for a relationship, a job, for an environment born purely out of your own flesh engineering, you doing things on your own, that situation naturally opposes and persecutes and drains your spiritual destiny. And the word gives us strict instructions for our protection. Cast out the bound woman. You cannot let the counterfeit coexist with your destiny. The shortcut cannot inherit what belongs to the promise. So how do we survive the waiting room without giving into the flesh? How do we keep from manufacturing an Ishmael or selling our birthright like Esau? We do it through the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit inside of us. Galatians 5:22 designed specifically to sustain us. So we're going to go to Galatians real quick. And we know Galatians talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And we have to have the fruit of the Spirit to be able to go, I feel like the fruit of the Spirit helps us to do anything in life. Okay, so Galatians 5, it says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified their sinful nature with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking, and envying each other. So when we're talking about long suffering, we're talking about patience, endurance, steadfastness, perseverance, especially as shown in bearing troubles or illnesses, slowness in avenging wrongs. So when somebody do you wrong, we're gonna, we're not going to take up on trying to do stuff on our own to avenge them. Then we have perseverance, which means cheerful, and this is the Blue Letter Bible definition. So cheerful or hopeful endurance, the characteristics of a person who is not swerved from his deliberate purpose and loyalty to faith, even the greatest trials. So I want to talk about settling in relationships and marriages. And I want to bring this to us on an earthly manner, because where we see this play out most, we see a lot of settling in relationships. We see a lot of people settle for marriages. We see a lot of people settle for jobs and everything. And I was one of those people who settled in marriage, and now I'm divorced. And thank God for restored time, because He's a restorer. God restores time, and He gives back time. And a lot of people settle, and it's very destructive, especially in relationships, especially in marriages. And that same exact spirit that caused Sarah to look at Hagar and invoke that Babylonian law of her days is the same spirit that whispers to a lot of single women. You're getting older, so you just lower your standards. He doesn't have to love God. He just has to have a good job. You gotta have good character. He don't have to pray like that. And they marry potential. And we cannot use worldly shortcuts and bypass supernatural weight and expect for kingdom result. To just escape loneliness and buying a temporary mode suit. So if we marry in the flesh, guess what we got to do in our marriage? We have to learn how to try to sustain it entirely. It will create an environment of emotional warfare, resentment, and constant draining of our oil. So most of everybody have married, or been married before. And this is for me. So this was for me. Do not trade your spiritual birthright for a ring, a title, or a quick validation boost. An underlying open door, which is a distraction, not a blessing. And so the last word that we were talking about was will. And I kind of want to talk about the three different types of will. And it's all going to add up. I promise it's going to come together. Understanding the three levels of God's will for us. To protect our legacy, we have to understand that God's will operates how it operates. So Romans 12:2 lays out 3 distinct dimensions of his will. It says, be not conformed of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good, permissible, and acceptable and perfect will of God. The permissible will of God is what God's sovereignty allows or permits based on our stubborn insistence. Even when it falls short of his highest design, God respects our free will. So if you demand an alternate route or shortcut, he's gonna step back and say, you can have it your way. Like, you can do whatever you want to do. Hosea 13:11 says, I gave thee a king in mine anger and took him away in my wrath. Israel grew impatient and demanded a king like the other nations. God permitted it, but that wasn't his choice for them. But it brought them generations of systemic turmoil. So sometimes God will allow us to do whatever we want to do because that's what we want to do. He's going to give you the free will. He's going to let you do whatever you want to do, but just know that that is not his perfect will for you. Mm-hmm. Then we have the acceptable will. This is what aligns generally with God's moral standards. It produces a clean, decent, and upright life, but it may completely lack a specific alignment. So it's walking in the fundamentally good, yet missing the precise assignment tailored for our specific calling. 1 Thessalonians 4:3 says, for this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that you should abstain from fornication. Then we have the perfect will of God. This is the absolute, uncompromised, sovereign intent of God for our lives. It has no shortcuts, no fleshly substitutes, and no premature moves. It requires deep patience. It requires deep endurance and long suffering. But its results is going to be flawless and permanent inheritance. Ephesians 5:17 says, wherefore be ye not unwise, but understanding what the will of the Lord is. So the critical difference is the permissible will is born out of human impatience. Abraham taking Hagar, Esau grabbing the stew. God allows it, but you have to carry the consequences that comes with that. The perfect will can only be birthed by the Spirit through our complete surrender to his timing, which was supposed to be Sarah bearing Isaac and Ruth waiting on Boaz. I want to talk about the danger of disobedience. Sometimes our inability to master our appetites and our constant complaining causes the delay. The Israelites, what took them supposed to be 11-day journey, took them 40 years to get to their promise. According to Deuteronomy 1:2, the journey from Mount Sinai to the promised land was supposed to take exactly 11 days, but it took them 40 years, one around the desert, before they could even get to their promised land. Why? Because they're constant complaining. The moment things got hard, they stopped trusting God because they refused to be content with God's process. God made them wonder until the rebellious generation died out. But notice God's grace. He didn't let them starve. They had no choice but to learn how to be content in that moment. And what God provided in the wilderness, he sent manna daily. Their shoes didn't wear out. They had water, they had everything that they needed, and they couldn't just do whatever they wanted to do in that moment. They had to learn how to be content, walking around. What supposed to took them 11 days took them 40 years. So for 40 years, every day for 40 years, 365 days for 40 years, they had to know how to be content. And that's crazy, because I don't want to take 40 years learning how to be content and being okay with where I am and waiting on God, when he was saying, okay, Jannai, I'm going to give this to you in 11 days if you just follow me. If you just do it exactly what I tell you to do, you're going to get this in 11 days. Now, how many times have we missed out on blessings and we done delayed our promises, and God spoke something to us 15 years ago, and then it didn't happen right when we expected it, and because we didn't happen right when we expected it and when we wanted it, here we are trying to do something that God was doing already behind the scene, and now it's taking longer for us to get to our promise, and we're delaying our promise because we done decided that we want to do it our own way. So the Israelites stuck in the wilderness for 40 years when it was only supposed to take them 11 days to get to the promised land. But I want to talk about what it's like for active, holy contentment. What does it look like when we refuse to compromise? And when we choose to protect our spiritual legacy, unlike Esau? I want us to look at Ruth. Ruth experienced a devastating loss. Her sister-in-law, Orpah, chose to go back to what was familiar. So she went back and settled in Moab. But Ruth committed herself entirely to Naomi and Naomi's God. And what did Ruth do in her season of waiting? She didn't sit in the house grieving over what she lacked. She decided to actively be content. She went out into the scorching sun and she worked hard in the fields. While she worked faithfully, Boaz noticed her and protected her. And she didn't even notice, she wasn't paying attention. You know, she didn't think that this man was going to be really paying attention to her. She just went out there to do what she needed to do to make sure that her mother-in-law was straight. But because of her profound contentment and hard work, she didn't just survive the loss. God gave her a covenant marriage and placed her directly into the lineage of Jesus. So the Apostle Paul wrote the ultimate manual on contentment. And he didn't write it from a 5-star hotel. He wrote it right from prison. And he had to be content in the conditions. And Paul was very well-rounded. Paul was very well-rounded. In prison, it was cold, probably, damp. And back then, the conditions were totally different than what they are now. So I can only imagine what he was dealing with while he was in prison, trying to write about being content. He said, I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content. Can you imagine me writing something like this in prison? Like, I can't imagine writing nothing like that in prison. Because I'd be like, listen, I'm hungry. The food trash. The guards are disgusting. You know, they here whooping up on me. They busting my head up and I'm ready to go. You know, I can't write nothing like, I wouldn't be able to write anything like that. You know, but for him to write something like that under the circumstances that he was in, he said, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. And so he said, I have learned to be content. Contentment is not a natural feeling. Your flesh does not want to be content. I don't want to be content sometimes, you know, and that's what the flesh does. It wants to panic. It doesn't want to be in contentment, but contentment is discipline. It's the internal muscle. It's like a muscle that we have to keep strengthening to be able to build up while we're waiting on God. 1 Timothy 6:6-8 says, but godliness with contentment is a great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. So the world tells us that getting more stuff is great gain. The kingdom tells us that having peace in our current season is the greatest wealth that we can possess. Hebrews 13:5 says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Your contentment is not based on what is in your bank account or holding your hand. Your contentment is anchored in one irrefutable fact. The creator of the universe promised that he would never leave us. And then if we want to know why we can afford to be content and understand the upgrade of God's, that God has given us, we talked about the blood covenant that was given to Abraham, and Abram, because his name wasn't changed at that time, it was Abram at that moment. He messed up. He brought Hagar to the mix, created Ishmael out of compromise and fear, and delayed the promise, but God still kept his covenant with him, because God cannot lie. And as New Testament, as we're under a new covenant, we have something even more powerful. Hebrews 8:6 says, but in fact, The ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one. Since the new covenant is established on better promises. So Jesus Christ is the mediator of the better covenant. It was God's faithful, if God was faithful to Abraham under the old covenant, when Abram was making mistakes and shortcuts and Sarah was doing things out of fear, how much more secure are we under a better covenant? Sealed by the perfect blood of Jesus. So we don't have to force the blessing to happen. We don't have to force things to happen. We don't have to force marriages to happen. We don't have to force better jobs to happen. Just like Esau, he didn't have to work for his birthright. It was already given to him. He didn't have to work for the promise. It was already given to him. He wasn't just content in the moment. And we don't have to work for those things because Jesus already signed the sovereign decree with his own blood. Because we're our heir of better promises. And so, I'm almost done. This is the last part. I just want to bring the whole picture together from the spectrum of God's word. Sarah looked at her biological clock, painted over her emptiness, set up for the permissible will, and manufactured an inch nail out of haste, fear, convenience, and bondage, bringing a decade of domestic chaos. And not only that, we have wars that were created because of her haste. Like even biblically, even now, when we look at that time and where we are now, if you really pay attention to history, a lot of the things that are going on now is because out of the hastiness of what Sarah and Abraham did, because they didn't know how to be content.
Wow.
Isaac was born cleanly and powerfully out of his promise, proving that what God originates, he flawlessly sustains without human legal codes or fleshly engineering. Esau inherited that exact blessing of Isaac, but panicked over a temporary hunger, settled for a quick bowl of stew, and traded his entire birthright, causing a lifetime of heartbreak, turmoil, and rejection. The Israelites allowed the discomfort of the desert to turn an 11-day journey into a 40-year of necessary wandering. Ruth looked at lost, refused to settle for the familiar idols of Moab, worked her field with fierce contentment, and walked straight into a sovereign destiny. Paul sat in chains in a Roman's prison and declared that because of Jesus, he possessed a secret strength that completely conquered their environment. So where are we standing today? The exact same spirit that caused Sarah to compromise and Esau to trade his legacy is trying to make you settle. We settle for dead-end jobs, toxic environments, and stagnant lifestyles out of the pure fear of scarcity. An unaligned open door is a distraction, not a blessing. If a situation requires you to compromise your personal relationship with God or sell out your standards, you are treating your holy birthright like it's cheap. Settling for less than what the better covenant has guaranteed you. That's what you're doing. God is using the exact same waiting season to completely pioneer you. He's building the character inside of you required to sustain the massive promise he is about to hand over to you. The blueprint for an active covenant, how do we walk this out? Ecclesiastes 9 and 10, contentment, and I'm gonna go over and read that really quick just so you'll know what it says. It says, verse 10, whatever you do, do well. For when you go to the grave, there will be no work or planning or knowledge or wisdom. Verse 11, I have observed something else under the sun. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race, and the strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise sometimes go hungry, and the skillful are not necessarily wealthy, and those who are educated don't always lead successful lives. It is all decided by chance, by being in the right place at the right time. Verse 12, people can never predict when hard times might come, like flesh in a net or birds in a trap. People are caught by a sudden tragedy. pretty much, we want to really just trust in God's divine timing. We don't ever want to base our success off of other people's success. We look at other people and then we start trying to generate what our lives supposed to look like based off of other people, because here we are comparing what we got going on to somebody else, and we don't know that they scamming.
They scamming that.
People got millions of dollars and they not getting it the right way.
Mm-hmm.
We see it on social media. We look at people's relationships on social media and be like, oh, that's couple goals, and don't know that Ray Ray is whipping up on his girl, but they post it up on social media and it looks good.
Right.
And so we just comparing our lives to other people, and then when it looked good for them, we get frustrated because we're not where we think we're supposed to be.
Right.
Here we are creating things and chaos, unnecessary heartbreak, and unnecessary divorces and things of that nature, because we don't want to truly wait on God for His perfect will, not His acceptable will, not His permissible will, His perfect will for us. I told God this year, I said, God, I want your perfect will for me. I don't want my will to be in a way. I want your perfect will for me. You know, and so the last thing, if we settle out of fear, we fill those exact spaces in our life, not with God's promises, but with our own will. And we create an Ishmael situation. We get our bowl of stew versus getting our full inheritance that God has for us. And remember that we belong